Appreciate again Matt the invite to talk a little bit, and I want to give some recognition right up front because as any good extension educator knows, you don't recreate slides you don't have to, right? So I've borrowed a number of them from colleagues in the room, and they'll recognize their individual slides, but those contributors included Dan Loy, Matt Spangler, J.R. Tate. I'm sure there's some others on the list in there. But what I wanted to do is give a little bit of an overview of why feed efficiency is important, and I was reassured by your responses to my questions earlier that you think it's important. I'll hopefully convince you even further why it's important and to what degree it's important, but also pose a few questions and some challenges along the way. And then hopefully by the end provide a bit of a compelling argument why genomics is really the only opportunity we have to make broad influence and broad impact in selection for feed efficiency traits. Okay, so feed efficiency and feed costs, obviously a big part of our business. Feed costs historically between half and 70% of the cost of production in beef enterprises. As corn gets close to $7 a bushel, that influence, particularly in fed cattle diets, has a big impact on the feed costs as a percentage of total costs, and that can approach 80% in many of those feedlot operations. And one of our motivations obviously is not only profitability in our system, but how do we provide that in a sustainable way? Obviously there's lots of competition for resources that we use in production agriculture here in the United States, and certainly for those products, both domestically in terms of we think about corn, not only in beef cattle rations, but pork and poultry rations, ethanol production. And I saw a statistic a while back that just continues to shock me that we used more corn last year in ethanol production than the entire corn crop we grew in the United States in 1976. Okay, so that's just get your head around that. It's a huge amount of corn that we use outside of typical agricultural uses, and so we need to continue to think about how do we be better stewards of those resources in beef production as a way to not only be better stewards, but also provide some sustainability to our production systems. Okay. I'm a lefty, so I like to do little examples and work out the math to figure out how big an impact things have. And surprisingly, a relatively small change in feed efficiency has a huge impact in our business in terms of dollars. Okay, so this is some data put together a year ago, but looks at our feeding system here in the United States, calf feds and yearling feds. In our system, going from about 600 pounds in weight to 1,250 out weights on the calf feds and 775 to 1,300 on the yearling feds. In our system, about a third of the animals historically have been calf feds, about 2/3 yearlings. If we decrease feed intake, so I used RFI as sort of the metric here, decrease daily feed intake during the respective feeding periods, that's roughly about a 10% decrease in daily feed intake. Those animals on a dry matter basis, we consume somewhere in the mid-20s during peak intake at the feed yard. That results in about a $1.2 billion direct savings in feed costs. Okay, that's not with an M million, that's with a B billion. Okay, we feed about 27 million head in the United States. We'll have less obviously this year because we had a really small calf crop last year, but this is a huge number. Okay. And that's not inclusive of all the costs. That's just the direct feed part, right? Think about, well, if we deliver less feed to the pen, that means we have less diesel fuel through the truck, less time and labor. You can think about all the things that go with that in terms of delivery of feed. So this is likely a low estimate. Just an astronomical savings that we can achieve through relatively modest decreases in feed intake, okay? And this doesn't touch the decreases that if we could change maintenance requirements of beef cows. Remember, half the calories in our production system are consumed by beef cows for maintenance. Okay, so there's a huge potential savings to our business by changing feed intake and feed efficiency metrics in our systems. Okay, the challenge with that is that there's lots of ways to sort of skin this cat, right? From an animal physiological standpoint, these more efficient animals might have improved digestion or metabolism of nutrients that they consume. Alternately, they may utilize those absorbed nutrients more efficiently. So there's lots of things to think about as we think about not as it just delivered feed to the feed bunk, it's how that animal intakes the feed, how it digests the feed, how it uses the feed, how it takes those nutrients and deposits either lean or fat tissues, and so forth through the growing and finishing phases of our system that has an impact. So feed efficiency is a pretty complicated thing. Of course, we've got the interactions of maintenance and tissue turnover in the animal and the calories required to do that, but also the calories required for production. If we think about animals in a feed yard, obviously that's growth of tissue, but it gets more complicated if we think about cows on range, so forth. And certainly as we expand from individual animal perspectives to herd perspectives, thinking about the efficiency of cow herds versus the efficiency of individual animals. As you can see, it gets pretty complicated. That said, we've seen change in improvements in feed efficiency. This one happens to be feed to gain, so the inverse of feed efficiency per se. A decrease over time, largely driven by increased growth rate of animals in our system. We've selected over time for animals with better weaning and yearling weight, post-weaning gain, and certainly larger mature sizes. So we've in effect have diluted maintenance requirement through the feeding phase and made those animals more efficient during the growth phase, and at about 0.05 of a pound per year. So not a huge improvement, but about a 1 pound improvement over those 20 years. This is some just monthly summarized data indicating the same thing, a downward trend in feed to gain. Okay, so we have made improvement, but we've made that improvement through indirect selection for feed efficiency. Okay, we've done it through selection for gain. Think about what improvements we might make if we actually selected for the trait that's of economic importance to us, okay? And I say that a little tongue-in-cheek because when we get towards the end, you'll see that maybe feed efficiency might not be the direct trait we want to use in our genetic evaluation systems, okay? But by and large, we know that various measures of feed efficiency or feed intake have moderate to high heritabilities. So we know we can make change. There's a huge genetic opportunity out there because those genetic opportunities are largely untapped. We haven't had a direct measure to select for those traits historically. Obviously lots of different measures. If you follow any of the trade literature or fed cattle, you'll have seen some of these. Obviously feed to gain or feed efficiency as a raw measure is commonly reported in feed yard closeouts. Obviously we've got an in weight, an out weight, and feed delivered to the pen. It's a pretty easy metric to compute on a pen basis. It's much more difficult obviously on an individual animal basis because you have to have what? You gotta have individual feed allocation records, okay? And those are pretty expensive and complicated to get. Certainly adjusted feed to gain, similar problems in terms of record availability. Lots of discussion in our both scientific and trade literature over the last few years relative to residual feed intake or residual average daily gain. You know, new concepts presented in the 1960s that we're finally getting around to fleshing out and understanding in our business. And certainly adjusted dry matter intake is another measure of gross efficiency, if you will. So not only do we have different measures, they have different contexts in different parts of our production system. And so I think you'll agree with me that it's a pretty complicated nut to crack. Again, genetics play a big role, moderate to what I would call high heritabilities, obvious correlations between, so this is average daily gain, dry matter intake, residual feed intake, gain to feed. Heritabilities on the diagonal, genetic correlations above. Thanks, Dr. Spangler, for this slide. Genetic correlations are positive between gain and dry matter intake or residual feed intake. The old adage that intake drives gain is very true. If they don't consume feed, they don't gain. Okay? The challenge we have is we're trying to separate those two things a bit in terms of finding animals that gain well or gain acceptably and doing it on equal or less feed. Obviously, residual feed intake and gain to feed negatively correlated. So there's associations in this data as well as other measures that we commonly collect like weaning weight or post-weaning gain. Okay? We do have some EPDs for efficiency available to us in the industry today. We're not without those in our business, certainly. Residual gain, published by American Angus, Days to Finish, published by American Gelbvieh Association, are two notable pieces. We have some maternally oriented ones, maintenance energy requirement, and a $W that reflect differences in mature weight and lactation potential as that relates to maintenance requirements for those cows. And certainly some others in the same sort of vein in index approach. One of the things I think is very interesting is there's much debate in our business about which is the right metric to use in selection. So a nice paper by Rolfe and others in 2011. A number of co-authors are actually in the room. So if I mess this presentation up, I've read the paper a couple of times, and it's a good and long paper. But there's a couple of kernels in there that I think are really important for us to pull out. And aside from a lot of other points in the paper, one of the ones they elaborate on is understanding these expected responses per generation of selection based on different metrics. Okay, and the metrics they use are selection criteria or dry matter intake, post-weaning gain, gain to feed ratio, and then four different proposed indexes. The direction of selection that was viewed to be favorable for improving performance, and then the response in terms of units of intensity and kilograms for dry matter intake and gain. So this is what you would expect the change to be given the selection. And certainly if you select for decreased dry matter intake, obviously you can achieve decreased dry matter intake, but of course what happens to gain? As expected, it goes down. Certainly if you expect or select for increased gain over here, you get gain, but it comes at a cost, right? We don't have any ability to fight those genetic correlations or the antagonisms there when we select on only one of these particular traits. Gain to feed, of course, is a ratio of inputs and outputs, and so we do see some separation of intake and gain in that instance. But when we start looking at some of these indexes, we see pretty varied response. And I'll just ask you guys, I don't have a clicker slide to do this, but I'll ask for show of hands. As you look through those four different indexes, which one of those do you like the best in terms of its performance? Okay, I won't bias you any more than that, but in terms of performance, which one of those do you like the best in terms of outcomes, under the presumption that we want to increase profitability? Okay, so kind of seat of your pants evaluation of these. So of those of you, and everybody has to vote, okay? And I'm a pretty fast counter, so I'll keep track, okay? How many of y'all like index 1 as the best index? Okay, well, there's about 5 or 6 of you, okay? How about index 2 here? Anybody like index 2? Okay, how about index 3? Okay, lots of people like index 3. Okay, and who likes index number 4? Anybody? Okay. Yeah, I see you. Okay, there was one other, but that's good. I might ask for some explanation here in just a minute. But good, I think that likely represents the divergence of views we have across our business as well. Okay, so there's probably a right answer, but I think the representation here represents some of the challenges we have in our business, because if you go and look at those indexes, what they actually are, and those co-authors in the audience know what those indexes were, obviously, but the first index was strictly phenotypic residual feed intake. So select for residual feed intake, you drive down dry matter intake, had a slight positive correlated response in gain due to the genetic correlations that existed in this particular data. Oops, wrong direction. Number 2 there was genetic residual feed intake, and you remember one of the key components of residual feed intake that makes it desirable is its independence of average daily gain and metabolic weight when you make selection. And so, in fact, you didn't see any change in gain the independence is working, the regression's working correctly. All of that was driven towards a decrease in dry matter intake, but slightly less than what we observed when we did it from the phenotypic scale. Number 3 there, which was the most popular choice among you in the audience, represents an economic index of dry matter intake and average daily gain, or post-weaning gain rather. Okay. Number 4 then, that was this one. Number 4 had no change in dry matter intake, but about a 7.7 unit increase in gain. And that one happened to be an economic index driven off of residual feed intake and gain. Okay? So which one of those was the best, though? That's the question. Okay? And Dr. Nielsen raised his hand as he was one of the sole voters for number 4. Dr. Nielsen, why did you like number 4? Okay, so I read the paper right then when I got the idea was that this amount of decreased dry matter intake didn't offset the loss of this gain, okay? And that makes sense to me, given the differential between the value of this unit's cost of feed versus the value of gain. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. But again, the idea is that these indexes, particularly of measurements of intake and measurements of gain, did a much better job economically than any of the alternatives that were proposed. Okay? Which we'll get back to that in just a second, because I think one of the key things that is coming out of some of our discussions related to the Feed Efficiency Project, as it's commonly known amongst us, but the National Program for Genetic Improvement of Feed Efficiency in Beef Cattle. Logos here. One of the projects is helping fund this meeting, and a number of us in the audience are involved with. One of the things that keeps coming up in our discussions on the extension side is, what is the appropriate vehicle to deliver results to you all, either commercial or seed stock producers? And the more and more we discuss that, the more and more convinced we are, and supported by research that we just discussed, that a selection index strategy really is the right way to deliver the end results, okay? Recognizing that as we move along, some of the research results we get in our project are actually molecular breeding values and prediction equations to calculate EPDs for feed intake or residual feed, whatever the unit we decide to describe on that side. But the end result and the tool that will be most useful for you all is the economic weightings and selection index application of that knowledge. Okay, and so to bridge that gap, of course, we have a lack of feed intake records across our business on individual animals that sort of inhibits broader adoption of a phenotypic-based national cattle evaluation system for feed efficiency traits. How do we fill that gap? Well, the reality is that for traits that are A, very expensive to measure, have high economic returns, are heritable. Dr. Manningham, I'm trying to quote your paper. What other criteria? And they're expensive, difficult to measure, heritable, late in life. Those all lend themselves to some kind of genomics application. And certainly feed efficiency fits many of those definitions in terms of particularly the expense and difficulty of measuring those and the economic impact it has. And so we think the genomics tool helps us in a great way to help predict breeding values for feed intake and feed efficiency. But as Matt pointed out earlier, we need to continue to collect phenotypes, right? We've seen a couple of points today about the necessity to retrain panels and continue to capture data. We'll need to do that. We can't just develop our training and walk away. We have to remain committed to that, but this is a case where the potential impact and value of that change is very large, okay? Aside from molecular breeding value prediction, I think efficiency and metabolic performance of animals is still an area of animal sciences that has much to be learned, particularly at the genomics level, and understanding the gene networks and pathways that influence the performance of our animals will continue to be an important part of our science, and eventually that information will make its way into a variety of genomics tools that we deploy. Certainly some early discussion today about marker-assisted management. Think about the implications we might, or differences in management we might apply to animals in a feed yard setting if we knew the combination of their potential for efficient gain and their potential for, I don't know, say marbling and carcass weight. How might we manage those animals different in terms of nutrition environment, implant strategy, and so forth to optimize their performance through a feed yard setting? Okay, if we get to a point, Mark, where we can genotype animals for 250 for a couple thousand markers that are associated with those three traits, that has a 4 or 5 to 1 return on investment at the feed yard, that'll find its way into application. Okay, so I think there's a big impact out there. We've just got to continue to work towards seizing it. So I think in the long run, these molecular tools will eventually make their way into from an information standpoint, into our selection indexes, and that'll be ultimately the tool that gets deployed back to seed stock and commercial producers. So with that, Matt, I'll try and get us a little closer to back on time. Be glad to answer a couple of questions. I'm going to be around for the next day too, so if you've got an individual one you want to ask, be sure and do that.